Hello and welcome to Secular Sexuality, the ACA show that is just so damn happy to return a familiar voice. I'm Christy Powell, and I'm ecstatic to say that my co-host tonight is Miss Serafina Smith.
Hi, everybody. Welcome.
And our guest tonight is a speech-language pathologist specializing in gender-affirming voice therapy. Welcome to Tallulah, Breslin.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Well, tonight we are talking all about the voice, and you all know the favorite voice that we like to hear from everyone is yours. So if you could give us a call at 512-991-9242 or tiny.cc/callsex, because this show is starting right now.
All right, let's do it. Tallulah, we did an episode a while back with friend of the show, Billy Beard, who honestly just really fucked with my head when she talked to us about vocal therapies and explained that human vocal folds, everybody from like Brad Garrett to Yeardley Smith, have a fold that is only between like 1.5 to 2.5 centimeters long. All of that like variety and diversity in the way that we communicate can really come down to something incredibly tiny and seemingly insignificant. Do I really have it right in all of that?
Our vocal folds are the size of a dime or smaller, but our voice comes from our whole instrument, which is our torso, our voice box, and all the way to our lips. So we do have a big instrument.
Yeah. What are some of the other pieces, or what does all of that encompass?
So our breath drives our voice, and then we have our larynx that our sound comes from, and then we have our instrument, which is our voice box, our throat, our nasal cavity, our mouth, and our lips all combined together to make the sound that we hear.
Yeah, so you've got all of these different pieces, ideally working in harmony, or at least in their kind of own unique, eclectic blend. One of my crusades on this show, if we can call it that, has maybe been to help people realize just how subjective their experience of other people really can be. Can you walk us through some of the obvious and maybe less obvious impacts that our voice has on others and how other people see us?
Sure. Our voice has a very big impact on how people hear us. Some of the things that are more obvious are our accent, are where we came from, and some that like our emotion, our educational background. We know those type of things, but we can also have a lot of impact with our choice on how we use our voice. So if we have a really sweet voice, we have a lot of thyroid tilt, then people will want to hear what we have to say, lots of intonation, versus if we're very monotone and very vertical, then our voice will may not even listen to what we have to say. There's a lot we can do to influence people.
Yeah, what are some of the implications then? Obviously your voice is going to impact, I suppose, the way people see you. So that's going to come into play at your job, at maybe your romantic relationships or your peer relationships. Walk us through a little bit, I guess, just how sweeping some of this can be.
Okay, they asked me to move my mic closer, so I'm trying to do that.
Sure.
But yeah, no, I think so. I like to think of it that we all have the same pieces and parts to our voice, and we can use them differently. We also want to have a voice that matches us. So our vocal folds, right, like they vibrate. If we make them very thin and just touch a little bit, it's called stiff. And both Michael Jackson and Marilyn Monroe talk using that voice recipe. And in Michael Jackson, he did it to protect his vocal folds, and it makes us a little uncomfortable because it doesn't match what he looks like. And so maybe I wouldn't want to date Michael Jackson, but Marilyn Monroe has that voice recipe work for her. So, right, like, happy birthday, Mr. President. I may like that voice a little bit better.
Yeah, it's definitely a complex issue when you think about the impact of gender and expectation and, some of the maybe assumptions that people make rightly or wrongly, for better or for worse, about how people are supposed to sound. What kinds of assumptions do people tend to base on our voice or on the way that we express ourselves?
Well, there's so much that our voice communicates that people make a lot of assumptions based on it. There's research that's really old from Stanford, I think back in the 70s, that shows that over 95% of the message that people hears from us is from our voice rather than from our words. So people will tend to assume how we're feeling. So if I'm using a really rapid voice and I'm talking really fast and maybe I'm stumbling a little bit, you may think that maybe I'm a little bit anxious. Or if I'm talking really slow and maybe I need to think a little bit, you might not think I'm smart. Or if I have a more monotone, what's coded as masculine pitch pattern in our culture, and right, Hillary Clinton has a very feminine sounding voice, but she has a tendency to talk more like this, then we'll hear more power and authority in her voice. There's a lot that we can do to influence people.
Recently, I was looking at TikTok, which I'm outing myself as a TikToker now, but they were talking about flirting for women with other women, and how women tend to not recognize that you're being flirted with by another woman, and so the advice being given was to not speak in the higher register when you're doing it, like, hey, you're really pretty, but to take it down to a more in-depth vision, say, hey, you're really pretty, and just the difference that can be heard there.
No, that's actually really interesting. As a male presenting person who largely dates women, I have had maybe the opposite experience, or maybe I should say that oftentimes having a lot of women as friends and these different things, when I would make a comment like that and be very careful not to have it come across as flirty, I do find myself maybe raising like the pitch of my voice and maybe saying it a little bit softer, like, oh, you look really nice today. Comes across a little bit differently. Are we at all in the right ballpark, Tallulah? I mean, does this line up with maybe how you would coach people in these categories?
I know that there's a recent study that came out that found that people who use masculine voices, who have lower pitched, darker voices down in here, are more likely to sleep with more partners and be less likely to stay with just one partner.
Well, there you go. Yeah, however you want to interpret that. Whatever any of you want to do with that information, that feels like a superpower here. And I feel like it's important to remember. I know we've said it, and it's perhaps not that complex of an idea, but I don't know how many times we can say it before it becomes saying it too many. People don't live their lives as if this is true. I think we all recognize, and I don't think anybody listening is necessarily like shocked by this conversation, but as a therapist, particularly working around experiential work and helping people to get in touch with their nervous systems. We've talked on this show before about polyvagal theory and some of these other ideas around interpersonal neurobiology and just how people connect and communicate. I don't think I can say too many times how important it is to become aware of how your tone of voice, your diction, the rate of your speech, how all of these things communicate so much to the person that you're speaking to. And we don't necessarily prioritize it in this culture as much as I think we maybe should. Has that been y'all's experience?
So prior to COVID, I worked for 5 years in nursing homes, and I never had a good concept of how to modulate my voice. And so I had a job as a speech language pathologist where I would need to have other people help me help other people. And so I might say, hey, James, this is really urgent. You need to do this thing right now. And they wouldn't necessarily do it. And I've since learned, since I started exploring my voice, that if I were to say, hey, James, Mr. So-and-so really needs your help with this right now, it would be more likely that they would help and they wouldn't have that like instantaneous resistance to my tone.
Mm-hmm. So if that's the case, and people are, whether consciously or unconsciously, making all of these judgments about how we present and whether or not we're worth listening to or whatever else, what sorts of discrimination is experienced by folks who have the wrong voice, or maybe a voice that doesn't line up with our expectations or our assumptions about what it should be?
Well, the other end of discrimination would be the things that happen to people who do take control of their voice. Eating College in the UK teaches people how to do a lot with their voice, and you look at their politicians and the people in charge in their country, and over 50% of the people have been educated there. We used to think that all of these different skills for communication were the great equalizer, that everyone should know how to debate, but they've kind of been lost. And so when we don't learn how to use our words to communicate with intention and leave it up to sort of how we feel and let that feeling communicate for us, and we don't always have the same impact that we could if we had more control and awareness over it.
I think that is such a significant point. I almost wish I could just ask you to say it right over again. To respond to something that came up in the chat, it may seem like the stuff we're talking about is this sort of like pickup artistry manipulation type of thing. And I think it's worth recognizing that, yeah, you can use your voice to manipulate people because yeah, you can use your voice to manipulate people, but taking an active and intentional control of how you present yourself is not an inherently disingenuous or manipulative practice. It's just being mindful in the way that you are heard and understood by other people. I mean, has that been y'all's experience?
I also think that it's kind to be in control of our voice. So if people feel the way that we communicate feeling to them, and we had a bad day or something bad happened, and they then feel bad, whereas if we know how to communicate and help people feel positively when they hear our words, then we're gifting our voice instead of sort of just dumping on them, and that's powerful. It doesn't have to be manipulative. It just can be that we choose for you to feel good when we talk to you.
Yeah, I think that's very well put. Now, I'll say, as somebody who has a quote unquote girl's name and who I used to work on the phone for a number of years, even though the word Christy is not difficult to spell or to hear or to enunciate, people would constantly ask me, "Wait, what was your name? But okay, so how do you spell that?" Mostly out of fear that they would accidentally call me by a girl's name, which would be incredibly offensive. Of course, you would never want to accuse a man of being a girl. That would be, terrible. But because of that, people were often made a little bit uncomfortable or kind of surprised because of that mismatch. And I say that as a very privileged, able-bodied white guy. I'm curious what kind of discrimination is experienced by folks who don't have the voice that they're, quote, supposed to, or that society maybe tells them that they're meant to have.
There's a lot of different situations where people's voice is discongruent with what people might expect. I know sometimes people who are neurodivergent or on the autism spectrum will be assigned male at birth, but will have a really high-pitched voice, and that might not match. And then someone might question whether or not they're a girl, or they might face discrimination because of that. I think a really big area with discrimination that I come across are people who present as one gender, but their voice gets coded as another gender, and that can lead to a lot of different problems. It can lead to poor customer service or job discrimination, or unfortunately even harm. Black trans women in particular are at risk of experiencing harm when they get clocked.
I definitely hear that. Maybe outside of the perceptions of other people, what kind of experiences do people have intrapersonally, or when they hear their own voice? Does that create a sense of dysphoria oftentimes, or what can you maybe tell us about the way people experience their own voice in these sometimes tricky or uncomfortable ways?
Vocal dysphoria is very common with the individuals that I help with their voices. I think it is, right, like communication is so incredibly important, and when the sound of our own voice makes us feel uncomfortable, dysphoria is very uncomfortable to experience. we are less likely to want to talk. We might isolate. We might just try to speak as little as possible, not answer questions in class, and it ends up being isolating overall. And the more we become comfortable with our voice, the more that it reflects the voice that we want to hear, the more that we're willing to use it. And communication is so vital to all of our interactions that it's really awesome when we're more confident using our voice.
Well, no question. Here in just a moment, I'm going to give Sarah a chance to bring up our first caller. But while she's getting that ready, I'm assuming because of the work that you do, that you can talk to us at least a little bit about what the intentional training of your voice, or what taking some of these things on and working through some of the coaching that you offer and all of these different strategies can do. How can we change some of these outcomes for ourselves?
That is a very big question.
Sure.
Yeah, no, I think that there's a lot we can do. I think the very first step to start at if we want to change our voice is to make sure that our voice is healthy. I think that if we stay well hydrated, we avoid smoking. Smoking is very, very bad for your voice. It can be smoking anything, vaping as well. So we can try to cut down on smoking. A lot of times for HRT, we need to stop smoking anyways, or for gender reassignment surgeries, doctors will ask us to stop. Then we can try to control reflex. Mucus a lot of times can bother voices. Anything that is irritating, if we can get that under control, that'll get us ready to start practicing. It was a very big question, though. So if you want to start, maybe we should start there.
I definitely hear that that there's a lot that goes into the process. I guess I more meant to ask, are we able to change these outcomes? I mean, the work that you do, becoming more aware of everything from hydration to blowing our nose to some of the exercises that I'm sure you work with people on. How does that potentially change the way other people experience them? Or what's the best case scenario for perhaps somebody who wants to work with you?
So what happens after you do the work is that your voice is congruent with the voice recipe that you want. We all have the same pieces and parts to our voice. We all have a current voice recipe. So every different variable, the voice is the voice that we want, or the voice that we hear in our head has just a different set of setup for those variables. And when we learn, there's a process, right? You learn what the variables are and how to produce the different range. And then once you do that, you're able to hear, okay, what way do I want that, right? Like, would I prefer to have my larynx in a really low position, in a mid position, or in a really high position? And then once you can produce each variable, then you can start being able to get consistent, listen back to your recording and that sound the same every time. Then work on the feeling. How does it feel to have my larynx at a particular height? And then you're able to generalize that feeling to everyday speech until it just becomes part of your voice recipe. We know that you can change these things because you're literally already using them. We just use them differently.
Yeah, it's honestly really remarkable to see you kind of switch gears and move back and forth in those ways. I'm sure that is a skill that you've honed for a really long time, but from the outside, it's to me like watching somebody blow bubble gum or curl their tongue or these like other things that just feel so completely outside of my understanding of how to like navigate or manipulate a body. Yeah, okay, thanks, Sarah. For the podcast audience, Sarah's a jerk. Who can curl her tongue, and I cannot. But if you're done being mean to me, Sarah, why don't you take us to the phones to get us started there?
I don't know if I am done being mean to you, Christy.
Okay, fair enough.